Anyway, hey, it was a great worship time, you guys. Thank you. We are doing a study through the book of Acts. One of the things I love about doing study, it's the typical way that I do things, is I take a book and then teach through it. Not every chapter. The ones that stand out that I feel like there's something that I need to present that's in that particular chapter. Sometimes we bleed between chapters, but since they weren't originally written in chapter and verse, you'll forgive me if I do that. But part of the reason I like doing that is because it sets the agenda. The scripture, the biblical text sets the agenda, and except for maybe nuance, the subject matter is right in front of me, and it lends itself to helping us teach what the scripture teaches and not teach what it doesn't teach. So this morning we're going to do Acts chapter 9, the conversion of Saul, and I'm about to start my clock. So now I'm off to the races. I'm going to start out by reading, the wrong glasses on. Sorry, can't even see my phone with those glasses on. I'm going to start out by reading just the first two verses of Acts chapter 9. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them in chains to Jerusalem. Now, we talked last week, I did a 20-minute historical background for the history of Israel and what brought us to the first century during the time of Jesus and the book of Acts, the early church. As of yet, we haven't posted it. As of yet, we haven't put up our website. As of yet, we don't have a sign. All these things.
We do have a name.
Yeah, we do have a name. All these things are coming. It's slower than I would like, but we will get there. And once they're posted, and the missionaries who asked me for video of the teachings I did, obviously they have to wait until we get it all set up. But we are videotaping for that reason. So we remember from that discussion, and if you didn't, then I'm going to update you, that Stephen was executed not for being a Christian, but for attacking the temple. And it was the typical Greek-speaking Jewish perspective to marginalize the temple. You might remember that's what got Jesus in trouble as well, even though he was a Hebrew-speaking Jew of Palestine. But we also recall that a great persecution after the death of Stephen was aimed at the Greek-speaking Jewish Christians in Jerusalem that were gathered there. Now, Luke doesn't really tell us this, but we gather it from little clues, little hints that he leaves in the text. Luke is interesting. He doesn't want to tell all the bad news in the early church, but he also, as an historian, feels compelled to touch on the bad news and not neglect it completely. So he leaves us little clues. Now, I want to take a brief minute to promote the F.F. Bruce book, Men and Movements, Studies in Primitive Christianity, Primitive Christian Church. And this is a great little book if you are serious about understanding Paul, understanding the New Testament. This is a book you should go on Amazon and buy. I bought mine used for like $3. F.F. Bruce is a great scholar. It is from him that I was clued in to most of the things that I'm teaching about the Hellenistic issues in early Christianity. I used this book in my PhD work. It's a fantastic it's only 150 pages, and it's easy to read. Just don't get into the footnotes if you really want to just read through, but the footnotes are great. So, anyway, verse 3 says, "Now as he journeyed to Damascus," we're charting what Paul, and I'm going to call him Paul from now on, He is Saul, his Hebrew name. Luke tells us in Acts that at some point, when he was really reaching into the Gentile world, he changed his name to a Greek name. But it's confusing for me to swap back and forth, so I'm saying Paul from this point forward. Paul's headed north of Judea, right into the Hellenized region of Syria. So who do you think he's going after? He's not going after just any Christians. He's going after Greek-speaking Christians. Because even though Luke told us that everybody got scattered out of Jerusalem, you cannot possibly tell me that there are no Hebrew-speaking Christians in all of Judea. That Paul must go to Damascus to find some. It's one of the little clues that Luke gives us. Now, I'm not going to read any more of this text in Acts. I'm going to read from another source, but I'm going to quickly tell the story. We call it a road to Damascus experience. It's a common phrase in the English language in America anyway. It's a life-changing event happens to Paul. He has a vision, a dramatic vision of the risen Jesus. He's knocked off his horse. He's blinded. And when he gets up, he hears a voice that basically says, "Hey, why are you persecuting me?" And Paul's response is, "Lord, Kurios, who are you?" And Jesus says, "It's Jesus, the one you're persecuting." And now he's blind, and his buddies lead him by hand into Damascus, where a Christian's waiting for him. A man named Ananias has had a dream from God that he needs to go and pray for such a man. So Ananias had heard that Paul was there. He was afraid of him because the news had spread in front of him that he was there to round Christians up. But he goes and he lays hands on Paul. Paul is healed in his eyesight. He's baptized, and he's given a commission to reach the Gentiles. So Paul becomes a follower of Jesus. Now, if you want to learn about Paul, the best place to learn about Paul is in his own writings. So that's where we're headed. I want to read to you from Galatians chapter 1, where Paul is talking about his call and conversion. I'm not telling you that Luke is not reliable, but if we want to know about what happened to Paul, Luke wasn't there. Luke wasn't there yet. Luke doesn't come on the scene in the Acts account. Luke doesn't come on the scene until Acts 20, where you suddenly begin to hear the writers say, "We sailed here. We went here." Prior to that, it was they. So we're going to read out of Galatians chapter 1, which is probably written at least 10 years before the Acts account. And I've excised parts of it so that it wouldn't be overly lengthy, since I am constrained by time. "I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was it taught to me. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. But when God was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult with any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia, and later I returned to Damascus. And after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the brother of the Lord. I assure you before God that what I'm writing to you is not a lie. Then I went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report, quote, 'The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy.'" Now, I'm going to quickly unpack this crazy important text that we just read. It's a hugely important text for understanding Paul, understanding all of his... if you don't understand Paul, you're going to have trouble understanding the whole New Testament, because 2/3 of it's written by Paul. So this is a very important text. I'm going to quickly unpack it. Remembering that we're going to have question and answer and comment afterwards. Paul is clear that his gospel came directly from Jesus, the risen Son of God. Remember that none of what we call the New Testament had been written yet. Galatians is probably his second letter. It's hard to discern all the way, but we think maybe 1 Thessalonians was the first letter and maybe Galatians was the second. But it's a very early writing of Paul. And there's nothing else written yet. And it's hard for us to conceive of that. So when Paul says, the gospel I preached, he didn't have Mark and Luke and Matthew in front of him. He didn't have any of that. So his gospel, he claims, was given to him by revelation. Jesus somehow taught him the gospel he presented. Secondly, Paul makes it clear that after 3 years, he finally traveled to Jerusalem for a 15-day visit with Cephas. Some people say Cephas. The Greek is probably better read Cephas. It's the Aramaic name that Jesus gave to Peter when he said, I call you Cephas, stone, and on this rock I will build my church. So Paul is referring to Peter. Peter's the Greek translation of Cephas. Paul is referring to Peter by the Aramaic name Jesus gave him. That's very strategic and important. You will get it in a minute. Paul also uses the Greek term historia to describe this visit with Peter. So Paul's doing two things. Number one, he's making clear that he recognizes Peter as the head. Okay? By naming him Cephas. He doesn't always do it, but generally speaking, Paul refers to him as Cephas. We're going to see in the book of Acts later, in another very important text, Acts 15, that not everyone refers to Peter by that name. And it's important to note that. Secondly, he wanted us to know that his visit with Cephas, Peter, was historical in nature. It wasn't a casual visit. It was Paul, because he uses the Greek word that means history or narrative, he basically sat down with Peter and said, I want to know everything that happened while you were with Jesus. Tell me about him. What did he do? What did he say? Tell me, he'd probably heard the oral traditions that end up getting written down as the Gospels, but Paul wanted to hear it from an eyewitness. Tell me about Jesus for 15 days. I don't know about you. I would love to have been in that place where I could sit with Peter or Paul for 15 days and just say, tell me, and question him, Did Jesus ever laugh when y'all were, I want to know what he did. Number 3, Paul makes it clear that he didn't visit with any of the other apostles until the 3-year period. Verse 20 in that text, I assure you that I am not lying. Does that strike anybody other than me? When Paul says something like that, it's like, why is he saying that? Think about it. Now, we didn't read the text, but if you read the Acts account doesn't jibe perfectly with what Paul's telling us. The Acts account says he went to Jerusalem fairly quickly. Paul's saying, I'm not lying about this. I'm not lying that I didn't meet with any of the apostles other than Peter and James. And we're going to learn when we get to Acts chapter 15 and we keep studying Paul. It's very important to Paul that everybody understand, the whole sequence of events. And then lastly, Paul makes it clear that at this point, more than 3 years into his conversion and ministry, he was, quote, personally unknown to the churches of Judea. Okay? Remember? We said that only the Greek-speaking Jewish Christians are being persecuted. If no one knows of Paul in Judea yet, that's another little clue to me of that continent. Admittedly, he's already come to Christ, but it's still the context of what's happening in Judea. All right. That was a very quick rundown of the texts. I'm hoping you guys are thinking of questions to ask or comments to make. How do we apply this text in our lives? Okay? Seemed like a very drab, boring, historical approach. I am an historian and can be drab, so it may seem that way. Here's how we apply this whole thing into our lives. We must always be open for something new to come our way in our spiritual journey. The primitive church was not ready for the Apostle Paul. He was a disruptor. He turned everything around. It was only through him that the Gentiles really started being recipients of the gospel. So that the church in Jerusalem was not prepared for the something new that came their way. We'll see more of that when we get further into Acts, especially chapter 15. Took an antihistamine, so now I'm parched and dry. He was a monkey wrench in their whole way of thinking, yet Jesus appeared to him and gave him a mission. Even yesterday, I received an angry comment off my church history website by a guy, and I get these a lot. You guys may know some people like this. People who believe that we should be Messianic Jewish Christians. We should live under the old covenant. Anybody run into that? It's becoming a growing trend in Christianity. And they typically deny the Apostle Paul. They call him a heretic, and that's what the guy in the email basically told me. Paul's a heretic. We should be worshiping on the Sabbath. We should be observing the laws of Moses. I always tell people like that, hey, if that's what you want to do, go for it. I will not be there. Secondly, so we got to be ready. We got to be ready to be exposed to new things in our spiritual journey. Secondly, we have to be ready to receive someone else who has a new vision, a new turn of way of looking at things, a new mission that God has given them. We need to be open to that. We need to be open to the young man with tats who comes into the church wanting to do something different from what we're used to. I'll never forget when we started in Tuscaloosa at the Chi Alpha there to start trying to reach into the black community on campus. I asked one of our more out there, aggressive and musically talented young black men to lead our worship time. And the first thing he did was, he said, I'm going to have a choir. And I was like, okay. It's not something I've ever seen in Chi Alpha, but you know what? Okay. So he puts a choir together. A bunch of our black students, and then obviously a bunch of white students. It utterly changed our worship experience. It was so unbelievably dynamic. I remember sitting up in the upper part of the auditorium just weeping as I watched this dynamism that came into our worship experience. We already had good worship, but the roof would come off. The choir would be doing, and all of us would be singing with them, but it was dynamic. We had to be willing to change. Look, there were some people who didn't like having a choir. I never thought I wanted a choir. I liked that one. Black students that visited started staying with us in greater numbers because that's what they were culturally used to in church. They needed to, when they came in and saw we had a choir, they immediately thought, they felt at home. Okay, so we have to be ready to experience new things in our journey. We have to be ready to experience new people with new vision and a different twist on our journey. And then thirdly, we also cannot throw our leadership under the bus. This was a real struggle that we're going to read about in Acts between Paul and James, and Peter gets in the mix as well. And we're going to see it more later in the study. But we're going to see that Paul figures out a way to honor the men in leadership, even though he's not going to turn away from what the risen Jesus told him to do. He's pretty adamant about that. But the fact that he calls Peter Cephas, I'll just break the news to you. In Acts 15, James, the brother of Jesus, is suddenly in charge, and he doesn't call Peter Cephas. He calls him by his old Hebrew name, Simon. And that's a little clue of some of the internal struggles that are happening in the early church. This is why I consistently speak to the idea that we, and I mean the church, as we move forward with new thinking and new ways of worship, that we continue to sing hymns and try our best to let the older saints know that we appreciate them. That we're not throwing away everything they've worked so hard for in their own Christian experience. And I love that you guys did some hymns today. I thought that was awesome. It's real important that we let the older believers know that we value what they have done. And we try to incorporate, we all know that, to reach new people, we have to incorporate things that they relate to. But I've seen in the overall church, as we've moved towards being more progressive, we take that attitude to every segment of the population except the older saints. And we don't do any hymns, we don't do anything for them, and we wonder why sometimes we don't care if they don't come. But we can't be that way. It also goes, this concept of honoring those ahead of us who blazed a trail before us, why Protestants need to resist the urge to say judgmental things against Catholics and other branches of the church. Just do what you think you should without charging anybody else with high treason. I remember as a young man in a Assembly-of-God church being told all Catholics are going to hell. I unfortunately believed it because that's what I was being taught. But it's not only us who accuse others of high treason. Holy cow, I got to stop. All right? Man, that's the first time I've missed it. But I'm done. I was pretty much done.
We have to finish that thought.
I just recognized that. Hey, that was so abrupt when that buzzer went off. I was waiting for the little thing to grab me by the neck. But I messed up. I said too many things extemporaneously. The fact is, the Catholics still, some, not all, accuse Protestants of high treason. Orthodox believers tend to be more that way. That we're not in the true mother church. And we don't want to be that way. So that was to finish that. Questions? Comments?
I have a comment.
Okay.
And I thought that this would be good because you talked about the older saints. We got so many young people here this morning, and I didn't know this, but I was told this. Diane might not know it. I'm sure Ann knows it. That the church, the First Assembly of God, started over there on the corner right on Brundage Street, on Pecan Street right there. That's where the church started, right down from the employment office. Y'all know where that is? And the older people, they told me this, that they wanted to build a church so bad that they walked the streets and raised money. That I guess they took donations and did whatever.
Wow.
Ann can probably tell you more. To build that church over there. And there's a picture of all the ladies standing on the front porch of that church, before we added on the front. And I just wish we had a copy of that picture, because a lot of those older people, when I first started and you were at our church, they came. I don't know if you remember them, because you don't remember a lot of people. But
I sat on the front row.
Yeah.
And I was so zoned in. You didn't sit right next to me. I never probably noticed.
Yeah. But they would come, but they've died, and left us. But I think that's a good testimony to, we wouldn't be here today had they not done what they did. Right. And I thought that was, I like history.
Oh, I don't know.
And I especially like genealogy.
Comments? Questions? This is the time where if you had a good thought that came to you, seriously, it could be a good thought we all need to hear.
Right.
Even a good question is good to hear. I always when I was sitting in class at university, my classmates hated me because I was the guy that always asked a bunch of questions and kept us to the end of the class when he might have been ready to let us go 15 minutes early, but I had a couple questions. I think we learn when we ask questions. So, now you could argue I could have gone to his office, but hey, I was paying for him to answer my questions in the classroom. Comments or questions? Now's a good time. Yeah.
So, Paul says that he has this miraculous encounter with Jesus, and Jesus himself teaches him through divine revelation. Are we to take Paul's word for it? Does that mean that anyone today could also claim to have that same divine revelation of the gospel and take the same role as Paul as an apostle?
My, that's a good question.
Very good.
I would say it probably depends. It depends on what, if they are bringing some new theological idea that goes against 2,000 years of Christian history. I'm going to use this example, although I don't want anyone to think that I condemn these people, because I don't. But it's kind of like Joseph Smith. Supposedly digs up golden plates that saying things that go against everything. So, in that context, I would say no. However, if it was someone like William Booth, who had a new vision for reaching street people and launched what becomes Sunday school, that leads to a kind of a revival awakening in all of his country. And he did crazy things, William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, did a lot of crazy stuff that the church just thought was crazy. I mean, he took bar hymns, people would sing around drunk at the pub. He took those,
Melodies?
Thank you, melodies, had lyrics in my brain. He took those melodies, put Christian music together, and they marched down the street playing in a little band, playing these new Christian songs. So that would be an example of new that doesn't go against biblical teaching and theology. Paul was very unique, but the church has always struggled with the new guy who has a new ministry vision that goes against the flow. So, to be honest with you, that's about the best answer I can give. That's a great and difficult question that doesn't, in my opinion, good questions don't have usually perfect, clear-cut answers. We have to wrestle with them, and sometimes we get it wrong, sometimes we don't. A little bit later in church history, we had what we call the Montanist movement, and it was really one of the first renewal charismatic things that happened in the early church, where they had prophetic words, and they believed that the imminent return of Jesus was right on top of them, and they ended up being branded heretics. But it wasn't because of their theological views, it's because they refused to submit to the small c Catholic authority. The bishops around them. They wouldn't submit to them, and that's why they were branded as heretics, not for their theology, even though the theology was different. It was what we would call end-time prophecy. Unfortunately, it didn't happen like they said it was going to. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have legitimacy, in what was happening amongst them. So it's kind of complicated. Life can be complicated. Questions, answers, comments. I'm telling you, I think some of you had good thoughts running through your mind. Not a question, but a comment that might be good for some of us to hear. So don't be afraid. Now's the perfect time. Other questions or comments?
So you spoke a lot about diversity and being ready for the new in the church, and how including something that's different helps other people feel comfortable. Why is that so important?
Please just restate, or not restate, just say that again for me.
We talked a lot about diversity in the church, including something different, make them feel comfortable, and just being ready for something new. Why is that so important?
Okay, why is that so important? Another great question. And oh, by the way, when we have question and answer, it doesn't mean I'm the only one who can offer an answer. I'm happy if one of you raises your hand.
In my experience in the past, when a person walks in the church that's not been to church, they're not church, they're not used to going to church. And even when they get into church and they get saved and give their life to the Lord, they think in their mind that nobody in that church has done bad things like they have. They look at people in the church that nobody could be done the stuff I've done, And if you only knew, what somebody had lived and how their life had been, it would witness to you. But, we don't need to share all our dirty laundry. But, that I wanted to say that, but I want to say this. If you go into a place and nothing is familiar to you, you're a little bit uncomfortable. But it's just like if we sing a song that we know and we're familiar with, that we sing better. We worship better. But if we're having to learn the song, that interferes with being able to worship. So if you're more comfortable, if there's something that's familiar or somebody that makes you feel welcome, and just like that choir, that speaks to black people, and it'll speak to older people too. And it's just a familiar thing helps us to be more comfortable. And we do need to be comfortable. We need to feel like this is our family, and be comfortable and be accepted.
I see how it's important for the other people to be comfortable. I completely agree with you,
Uh-huh.
but how do we discuss this with somebody that doesn't feel comfortable when they come up to that situation, and they're not okay with having a choir, and you just
Yeah.
stress the importance of why you should be okay with it, and why changing something new is good and important.
Yeah.
And that's
That's
also
good,
a
yeah.
great follow-up that you just gave,
You answer that.
Sydney. I'm gonna tell. I said that 3 times. Didn't I? It was Trinitarian. I'm gonna tell the end part of my message that I did not get to answer that, what you just said. Years ago, a man that I respected came up to me. Now this is a little bit different because this was a personal thing, but I think the concept is important corporately as well, okay? I had a man that I respected come up to me and say, "Al, have you ever read The Practice of the Presence of God, Brother Lawrence?" I said, "Never heard of it." And he gave me a copy. He said, "You need to read this book." Anybody heard of that? Who's heard of The Practice of the Presence of God? Brother Lawrence. Okay. And he gave me a copy of it. And I read it. And while I was reading it, I was thinking, this is just stupid. I don't understand this at all. Why do I need to listen to a 17th century French Catholic monk? And I quit reading it. About halfway through, I just decided this is junk. I'm not going to read it. About 2.5 years later, in a different city, I'd moved. A man that I respected walks up in conversation and says, "Have you ever read The Practice of the Presence of God?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Did it do anything for you?" And I said, "Not really." He said, "You need to read it again." And I thought, okay, God, you must be wanting me to get something out of this book, because I had 2 men, 2 different contexts, don't know each other, tell me I need to read this book. So I read it again. I read it the whole way. And the second time I was thinking, there's something in here. I'm feeling it, but I can't put my hands on it. And it was frustrating. And I got to the end and I just said, I don't know that I got what I'm supposed to get. God, I can't help it. I tried. And I put it on my shelf. 3 years later, I'm at my Chi Alpha internship. And the guy that's mentoring me, I don't think it was Brady, it was Greg Smith, in our little group that I was a part of, said, "Al, have you ever read Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God?" And I'm like, "Yeah." "You need to read it again." So I went about reading it the 3rd time. And then the 3rd time I had what I would call a grace awakening. God broke into my life in such a powerful way and started a work in me that has continued to this day, a different way of seeing everything about my faith, a different way of understanding God and how I related to Him. I've mentioned this several times and I've had some feedback on it, but it all goes back to a crappy relationship with my dad. And my whole Christian experience was based on viewing God how I viewed my earthly father. That I had to do everything right. And if I didn't do it right, I wasn't in good relationship with God. And it took that third reading, and I vividly remember weeping, sitting against the, I can't remember what it's called, the heater unit in the old house. And yeah, at the home. What do you
The
call
furnace.
this? The
Radiator.
radiator. Sitting against the radiator. Sorry, but when you're my age and you have a word that you desperately want, it's hard to move off of that. So if your parents do that, you got to understand that's something that happens. But I vividly remember sitting there just weeping, and something was happening in my life. I didn't even really realize it for another little while. But that exemplifies what I'm talking about. We have to be willing to encounter new things on our journey if we want to open up new vistas of who God is and what He wants to do in our life. And for me, as I told you, I was very open. It was written by a Catholic. I'd been taught Catholics all go to hell. Period. So I immediately rejected it the first time I read it. But we got to be willing, and in a corporate arena, it's the same way. But that was expressing the person who was resisting the change. And does that relate to you? Okay, because yes.
I just